Welcome to Think Diverse, a fresh and deep look at the issues surrounding diversity and inclusion. I'm your host, Catherine De Vries, and I'm a Dean of Diversity and Inclusion at Bocconi University. In every episode, I will pick the brain of one of my Bocconi colleagues about their research about diversity and inclusion. This is also understand how diversity manifests itself in our daily lives, our society, and our economy. In this episode, we will touch upon poverty and inequality. Poverty and inequality have been central topics in social science research, particularly after the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. You might be surprised, though, to hear that not all countries have seen an increase in poverty over the last 2 years. In fact, according to Zachary Parolin's research, the poverty rate in the United States reached a record low after COVID-19 arrived. Zachary is an assistant professor at Bocconi University. His recent research has focused on trends in poverty and income inequality, both from a long-term perspective and most recently in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Zachary, thanks for joining us here at Think Diverse.
Thanks, Catherine, for having me.
So let me start with some basics. What is poverty exactly and how do we measure it?
Sure. So in the simplest definition, poverty can be understood as a shortage of resources relative to needs, or in a broader definition, having insufficient income to adequately participate in society. So when we think about resources, as I mentioned, we're generally thinking about income, how much you bring in from your job, from government transfers, from other family members. And when we talk about needs, we're thinking about some kind of a poverty threshold that says, if your income is below this amount, you probably don't have enough resources to live a minimally decent life in your country. And that poverty threshold can vary a lot. In Europe, it's often set at 50% of the median income, adjusted for family size. But in the US, which we're going to talk about quite a bit today, it really depends on where you live. So New York City, where housing costs are through the roof, your poverty threshold there is higher than it is in rural Missouri, where it's a bit cheaper to find a one-bedroom home, for example. And just to give you one number, for the average two-parent, two-child family in the US, the annual poverty threshold is around $29,000 in recent years.
So you gave us a bit of a kind of context about what poverty is and how to measure it, and actually that it's not that simple, and as you mentioned, especially that it's context dependent. I was also wanting to ask you if maybe the COVID pandemic has made you or has forced you to readjust the way you are measuring poverty in real time.
It really has, and I think to give a good example of this, let's go back a couple of years, say 2019, and think in 2019, how did we measure poverty at that time? Well, generally, countries measure poverty using a few different standards. They produce one measure of poverty per year. They produce that measure of poverty for each household based on the household's annual income, so how much they brought in over a 12-month period. And those poverty rates are generally released with a long delay. So, for example, it's 2022 now, and we're still waiting on poverty rates for member states of the European Union, or at least many of them, a year and a month after 2020 ended. So we knew in March 2020, when unemployment in the US climbed to around 20%, a record high, that those conventional measures of poverty weren't going to work for us. We couldn't wait until 2022 to know what was going on with households' economic situation in March and April of 2020. So my colleagues and I used a bunch of different data, a bunch of methodological tools, anything we could get our hands on really, to be able to produce a measure of poverty that can be released on a timely basis in real time, that captures families' incomes over the last month rather than the last 12 months, because we know that your family situation might be different in April 2020 after the pandemic arrives relative to January 2020. And we can release that estimate of poverty every single month rather than just once per year. And that's what we did, and that's turned out to be an important tool for tracking economic well-being of households across the U.S., measuring the efficacy of policy interventions in the U.S., and what we found using these measures is that the policy interventions largely worked. In fact, we saw a record decline in poverty in 2020, despite the record increase in unemployment that I mentioned a minute ago.
So for quite some people, that would be a bit counterintuitive, right? So the idea that many people are losing their jobs, but actually poverty is at a record low or is lower than people would expect. So could you maybe explain a little bit how that could be possible?
Yeah, you're right. It's almost contradictory, it seems. 20% unemployment, the highest level of unemployment the U.S. had seen since the Great Depression. Yet, it reached a record low poverty rate. So how does it happen? Well, here's the stunning part. The U.S. is not typically known for having a generous welfare state. Again, we go back to before the pandemic and compare the poverty rate in the U.S. to, say, member states of the European Union. And poverty is almost, depending on the measure used, generally higher in the U.S. compared to EU member states. But in 2020, after the pandemic hit, something pretty remarkable happened. The federal government stepped in like it never has before in the U.S., provided stimulus checks to the vast majority of residents in the United States. It created a program that expanded access to unemployment benefits that not only deeply widened the eligibility for unemployment, but added a weekly benefit of $600 on top of the standard benefits. So $600 per week over a month, combined with the other benefits, you're bringing in $3,000 up to $4,000 per month in income support. And that's not to mention increases in food stamp benefits and so on. So just to put this into context, the federal intervention increased income transfers by such an amount that the money spent on stimulus checks and those expanded unemployment benefits alone in 2020 were greater than the combined spending on all other income transfers that existed in the American welfare state in that same year. It was a massive expansion of the welfare state, and it worked.
So that's kind of remarkable, right? In the sense that you're, giving these numbers and the fact that that response of the government was higher than like everything that was combined normally that people would get. So two questions about this. So are we seeing similar findings in Europe? So, Europe is characterized by more social spending normally or a more generous welfare state. And then the other aspect is to what extent maybe are these differences, if there are any, between Europe and the US, temporary because this stimulus was temporary?
Yeah, these are important questions. Right now, looking at data from the European Union, the picture is still not entirely clear. We have reliable data for some countries, and what they suggest so far is a mixed story. In Germany, for example, evidence points to a large increase in poverty, but other countries like Belgium are seeing small declines. Not to the extent that we saw in the US, but still achieving stable or even small declines in poverty rates amidst this pandemic is certainly a policy success. But there's a lot more we need to learn once the micro data become available. We don't know, for example, trends in child poverty across the European Union, and we can't make decent comparisons yet to the American story from that perspective. But your second question was about, is this just a one-year event? Should we read anything more to this about the U.S.'s potential to maintain low poverty rates? The one thing I'll say is it's not just a one-year event, it'll be at least a two-year event, because in 2021, there were some remarkable policy developments as well. And the most notable was the expansion of what's called the child tax credit. And in short, this expansion of the child tax credit provided unconditional cash assistance to 90% of families with children in the United States. Now, most countries have some kind of child benefit where if you have children, regardless of whether you're working, you get some kind of check from the government each month, just to recognize that it's expensive and it's tough to raise a child. The U.S. hasn't had something like that, but they had for 6 months of 2021. And our estimates again suggest that poverty is going to go down even more in 2021 relative to 2020. But let me close my answer to your question with this. That program I'm talking about is once again temporary, and it's set to expire. The last monthly payment went out last month, and it won't be extended into 2022 unless there's further congressional action. And if there's not then when we do get to a point where we're looking at poverty rates in 2022 or 2023, we'll probably be back to where we were in, say, 2019, where poverty in the U.S. is again higher than it is relative to most member states of the European Union.
So you kind of give us a sense of this kind of window of opportunity of legislation at the time of a crisis of the pandemic, and we'll have to see how that develops further. So could you also share maybe concretely a statistic or a number that you think gives us a better picture of the decline of poverty in the US during the pandemic?
Sure. So in 2019, the poverty rate using the measure of poverty most frequently used in the US was 11.8%. So that was before the pandemic hit. In 2020, that poverty rate declined to 9.1%. So from 11.8 to 9.1, and that represents something around 3 million people in the US who were lifted above the poverty line relative to their status in 2020. And again, when you dive into the data and figure out why that is, that decline is almost entirely driven by that unprecedented government intervention in terms of those stimulus checks and unemployment benefits that we talked about before.
So you already mentioned a little bit that it was maybe not a one-time occurrence or a one-year occurrence, but maybe a two-year occurrence. And actually, they were also under different administrations. So that's also kind of interesting for us looking at the US. But, could you tell us a little bit more about the extent to which we should be or could be optimistic about the degree to which the US can continue its poverty rates to be lower in the future, and what would be needed in order to get there?
The key thing that would be needed to be able to sustain low poverty rates, particularly among families with children, would be a permanent extension of this child tax credit that I'm talking about, this monthly cash support that's not conditional on employment. So even if you're out of work, you are eligible for this benefit. And as I mentioned, for 6 months in 2021, this payment was delivered in this form, not conditional on work. 90% of families with children received a check of up to $300 per child per month, depending on the age of the child. If you had asked me 2 months ago, should we be optimistic that this program will continue into the future and therefore maintain these relatively low poverty rates, I would have said yes. The Biden administration, the 50 Democrats in the Senate were almost in unanimous agreement that we should extend this program and pass a large piece of legislation to extend it into the future. Unfortunately, they couldn't get 50 votes. They counted up to 49, and one senator, in particular from West Virginia, was not completely happy with the legislation. And today, as it stands, we're hopeful, I think, that there's a chance this might pass sometime this year, but really nobody knows. So I'm hopeful. I think there's a chance to learn the lessons from these past 2 years and really turn the corner in poverty reduction in the U.S. But I wouldn't say today that I'm completely optimistic that that will occur.
So you mentioned that the bill that the Biden administration wanted to put through kind of got a vote short. So Joe Manchin, that senator from West Virginia that you mentioned, regardless of his reasons to vote or to be against this particular bill, there have been critics, including Manchin, but not only, that have argued that these were too generous policy interventions, that they would slow the economy, that they would actually lead to people not going back to work. It is also kind of related to the idea that there's been a great resignation, so a lot of people moving out of work into some form of government benefit. So what does the evidence say on this? To what extent are these, critiques of these more generous policies correct, do you think?
Yeah, I think there's two different contexts we can think about. The first time this discussion came up in the last couple of years was in 2020, when there was discussion about extending these $600 per week unemployment benefits. And the big concern at the time was that not extending them could lead to slowdowns in employment growth, etc. But I think it's important that we transport ourselves back to the middle of 2020 and really ask at that time, do we want to rush people back to these jobs where, in many of the cases, in terms of the unemployment beneficiaries, they were face-to-face jobs, service-type work, where they're coming across 50, 100, multiple hundreds of people every day with a very transmissible virus still active and alive and taking lives on a daily basis? Do we want to rush people back to work in that context? And I think from a public health perspective, the answer at that time was no. And it was a strange argument then to be making about possible employment effects back then. But there is a more legitimate question about what if we extend some of these benefits into the future? Could there be negative employment effects that slow down the speed of economic growth or the labor market recovery? There's been several studies that have looked at the child tax credit, for example, and the most believable estimates of employment declines are somewhere in the range of 200,000 to 400,000 parents. Remember, the U.S. is a country of 330 million people, so 200,000, 400,000 might sound like a lot, but it's really not. And when you think about what these parents would be doing if they did step back from work, well, they're just working in a different context. They're caring for children. They're spending time with their kids, and not necessarily going to that work with unstable hours, unstable pay, etc. So in my view, it's not even necessarily a bad thing if some of these parents receive a check from the government and decide to work a little bit less and spend a little bit more time with their children.
So also just to kind of, maybe go deeper into this particular issue of critics, do you think that there's another angle that could be basically proposed that would also, garner more support? I'm just thinking about the extent to which the US is also facing fertility problems and demographic change. Do you think that there's any way in which one could persuade, stepping aside these kind of unemployment arguments or employment arguments, but that there would be positive side effects on other parts of society?
Yeah, and in fact, typically, if you think of a big increase in cash assistance like this, you typically think that it would be primarily Democrats who would support such legislation in the American political context. But there's actually quite a few Republicans or conservatives in general who are supportive of this type of expansion of a child benefit for the types of reasons that you're talking about, for being a more pro-family country, for recognizing the importance of families and the time that parents can spend with their children, providing them just their time, but also promoting their development throughout their childhoods, leading to healthier adulthoods, and so on. So there has been sort of an unusual alignment between some conservatives and many on the left in the US in supporting this type of child allowance for many of the reasons you're talking about.
So just also to make it a bit personal, has there been a particular person that you met during this kind of research that you've done on poverty and inequality that has made an impact on you?
That's a good question. Of course, many, both in academia and obviously outside of academia, thinking about a lot of the families going through some of the toughest stretches of poverty that you can imagine. Hearing their experiences certainly motivates you as a researcher to try to make sure you're accurately accounting for their voice and presenting your data in a way that represents their experience. But if I'm thinking within academia, I think I have to go back to when I was a master's student studying social policy. I didn't know I wanted to do research. I didn't know I wanted to do a PhD at the time, but I had the chance to take a class with Professor Brian Nolan, who's an economist at the University of Oxford. And the course was Economics of the Welfare State. And I remember sitting in that class thinking that if I ever do go into academia or research, I want to be like Brian Nolan. He's someone who does research for the right reasons. He's careful in his work, level-headed in his discussions, and he has this intense pursuit of creating knowledge that's useful for the world. And those are the qualities that I've tried to embody to the extent possible in my own academic journey. And I think Professor Nolan for being an early inspiration and encouraging me to pursue research and encouraging me in the PhD and now as an early professor as well.
Well, it's really wonderful to hear also these kind of role models that all of us need within research. So coming back to your research, when I hear you speak, you could kind of say, well, it's all been kind of fine for low income families over the past couple of years. Some of them might actually have done better. Is that the right conclusion to draw?
Not quite. Not at all. It's really important here to separate income from well-being, broadly defined. There's a number of dimensions beyond income we could look at. They would suggest that, of course, families are struggling the past 2 years, and low-income families in particular. I can give one example of another element of well-being that's affecting low-income families harder than other types of families, and that's school closures right now. In a number of ways, I've done some work on this in the U.S. and find that it's lower-income families in poverty that perhaps due to where they live or for whatever reason are more exposed to school closures, or they have been at least throughout the past year and a half. And also we know it's just more difficult for a family with, let's say, less reliable internet connection, or without a spare laptop or computer for a child to use to attend school virtually, or without a dedicated study space or an extra bedroom where a student can go and spend a school day in peace while the parent's trying to work and get by his or herself. So a number of elements. School closures are one example where even if the government can step in and stabilize incomes, there are many other dimensions of well-being that are going to have long-term consequences in addition to the short-term consequences. And generally, those aren't favorable for low-income families in particular.
So your research really speaks to kind of policies, right? You talked about the kind of child benefit. You talked now about school closures and the extent to which schools actually are a vehicle for social elevation and might actually circumvent some inequalities that would arise out of closing them. What are kind of lessons, kind of in general that governments, or we should all take away from the past couple of years in terms of how we can learn about how to reduce poverty moving forward?
I think one of the key lessons, especially when we think about government responses during the pandemic relative to, say, the Great Recession a decade ago, is that high unemployment and massive shocks to the economy does not have to lead to high levels of poverty or food hardship or other forms of material hardship. There's an immense capability and also responsibility for federal governments or local governments to step in and provide families, provide individuals of all types with direct income support to make sure they can get by, meet their basic needs, and live a decent life, even when the economy is in turmoil. And also when the economy is doing better and people still experience unemployment. So I think the lessons we can take from the past 2 years is that a more generous welfare state is going to be better for all types of families, not only in the short run, but also in promoting the long-run development and well-being of families, especially families with children as well. And I think it's an important lesson that we learned from these past 2 years.
Very clear also policy advice for policymakers. So in closing, Bocconi University's motto is knowledge that matters. So I just wanted to ask you in the way you think your research matters.
I hope that producing these monthly estimates of poverty as we have and being able to demonstrate in real time the efficacy of policy interventions has been beneficial to the public good. And we're lucky to have some feedback into mechanisms where we know that's true. And we've seen our work discussed quite a bit in TV and newspapers, even in a presidential debate. So I like to think that my colleagues and I, the work we've done is contributing to the public good. It's creating knowledge that matters. And at the end of the day, I think that's the primary purpose of doing research. And I hope that our research has done at least a little bit of that over the last 2 years.
Well, thank you, Zachary, for your time. I really appreciate it. Thank you all for listening. This was Think Diverse, a podcast on diversity and inclusion from Bocconi University. To be notified about new episodes, subscribe to Think Diverse on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or Spreaker.